Join with me today is Derek Proulx of the Free State Project in New Hampshire. And welcome, Derek. Glad to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me, Robert.
Derek, you must be familiar with Andrew Breitbart's comment that politics is downstream from culture. And from my understanding of the Free State Project, what you're trying to do in New Hampshire, and I'd like for you to expand on this as much as you like, is trying to influence the culture of that particularly small state, only about 1.5 million people, in such a way as to gear the politics of New Hampshire towards liberty or freedom. And you've been recently in contact with a friend of mine, Mark Vandermoss, who started a similar project here in the province of New Brunswick in Canada called the New Brunswick Freedom Project, where he's trying to emulate the success of the Free State Project in New Hampshire. But before we get into New Brunswick Freedom Project and the travails we're going through in this country compared to your own, please, for our listeners, explain to us the Free State Project, if you would.
Sure. So the Free State Project is the brainchild of a professor here in New Hampshire. His name is Jason Sorens. He created an essay, and in that essay, to summarize, he did all the math. He's a mathematics professor, did all the math, and he found that if you had a state of around 1.5 million people living in that state, if you could get 20,000 people, 20,000 activists, motivated people who want to create political change, you would dramatically change the politics of that state forever. And so thus began the Free State Project. And so it began in small liberty forums online, people getting together, they heard about this project, and they started signing a pledge that wherever they decided that this free state would be, that they would eventually move there. And so there was a vote between these early signers of this Free State Project. And this was in 2001 was when this started. So over 20 years ago. This is a long road that we've made. So they had a vote of these early signers, and the top three states that they chose were Alaska, Wyoming, and the state of New Hampshire. And so part of the criteria of selection of states was access to government, easy access to government, low population, already existing culture of freedom and independence. So you look at places like Alaska, very rugged, very individualistic, many people out there on their own. Access to government is questionable in Alaska. It can be, they have less representation there. Same thing with Wyoming, but both had the low population. But eventually these early signers, they decided to go with New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is the granite state, and the state motto is live free or die. And that goes back to the American Revolution. We had a General John Stark, who was a big hero, especially in campaigns in Vermont and in New York. And General John Stark, he said as a toast, he actually didn't make it to this celebration toast, but he gave his toast anyways in a letter, and he said, live free or die, for death is not the worst of evils. And so that idea of living free or dying because death is not the worst of evil, living in slavery is, that has stuck around in the New Hampshire culture for many, many years. The United States has been around for almost 250 years now, and that kind of attitude here in the state of New Hampshire hasn't really changed. People here, very individualistic, very liberty-oriented. Every single year, people in New Hampshire, they go to their, what we call a town meeting, and everyone in the town who is eligible to vote, they go and they decide on issues ranging from budget to town officers, to zoning regulations, everything like that. The individual in the town can get together and get with his neighbors, his or her neighbors, community, and actually create change in their direct living environment. And so New Hampshire also has 400 representatives in our state house, our lower state house. And so that is, I believe, the third largest English speaking representation in the world is New Hampshire.
Wow.
And each representative in New Hampshire represents about 1,300 to 4,300 constituents. So all you got to do is go door knock on between 1,300 to 4,300 people and convince half of them to vote for you.
Now, those would be like registered voters, because doing the
Right.
math, 1.5 million divided by 400 is slightly more than that. It's about 3,700 or so, right? So you don't count children and people who are registered.
Right.
Okay.
And so very easy access to government. New Hampshire's population is 1.3 million.
Oh, is it?
So, yep. So very easy access to government. Don't really need a lot of money to run for state office. A state representative, their pay is $200 a term, 2-year terms. So there's no real big money getting into politics here in New Hampshire. Don't really need to spend a lot to run a campaign. I've seen plenty of people do it for the registration fee, which I believe is $5, and that's it. That's the only amount of money that they spent on their campaign.
Amazing.
Another great advantage with New Hampshire is that we have a coastline, which like Wyoming didn't have. And then we also are very close to population centers, such as Boston, New York, Portland, Maine. And also Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York. Our surrounding states are not liberty oriented. So by putting ourselves in New Hampshire, we've made ourselves more attractive to the liberty-minded people in those states because they don't have to move that far. They can still go to families for holidays and things like that, or still see friends. And it's not as big a commitment to move to New Hampshire from these large authoritarian population centers. So that was a strategic decision and why the vote for New Hampshire was made.
No, I can imagine that if you had chosen Alaska, that is off by itself, and there'd be no co-influence of neighboring states, because there are no neighboring states, unless you want to influence British Columbia, which would not be a bad idea.
Right, exactly. And even Wyoming, same thing. I mean, you've got Montana and Idaho, which are all fairly liberty-oriented states. So the pull to get people to move there just wouldn't be there for Alaska or Wyoming. So New Hampshire was chosen. You had these early signers, and the decision was made that once we had 20,000 movers that signed a pledge that said that they would move to New Hampshire to be activists and to create liberty, political change in the state, and that's would be what we consider the trigger for the move, where the Free State Project would be activated. And so a lot of these early signers, they started moving to New Hampshire on their own before the project really started, which 2016 was when we reached that 20,000 signer mark. And so these early movers, they came to New Hampshire and they started laying the groundwork, the foundations, and the footprint. So that way, when all these new movers started really ramping up and coming here, they wouldn't have to start from scratch. There would already be really highly motivated people already here, taking leadership roles and creating different organizations and side projects within the state of New Hampshire that could really kickstart the movement. And so that's what's been happening for the last 20 years. 2016, we had the big trigger for the move. And so since then, we've had a little bit over 6,000 movers, Free State movers to New Hampshire. We'd like to estimate that that's probably closer to 10,000 because in the early stages of the Free State Project, weren't really tracking movers that well. Now we are able to reach out a little bit more. We've got a more streamlined process for following up on our movers to see where they're at. And so we're able to get an accurate count. Last year, 2021, we had well over 1,000 movers in just 1 year. we're probably going to exceed that this year. We're already on track to do that as opposed to last year. So, and this momentum is just going to continue to build as New Hampshire gets more free.
Now,
And
these 6,000 people, though, they're not just 6,000 people who say, oh, let's move to New Hampshire because it's a freer state. These are activists.
yes. So the Free State, part of the pledge is to be an activist for liberty, right? But also, besides that, just the atmosphere of frontiersmanship and pioneership, right? Moving from, a lot of people come from California or Oregon, Washington, all the way on the other side of the country. They're leaving behind their friends, their family, their jobs. They're coming to New Hampshire for freedom, for liberty. And so these are the really hardy, motivated people that want to see change and that want to put in the work to have change. So yes, these are activists. These are really these are the go-getters. These are the creators of projects. These are the managers, the leaders that are going to really drive this movement. And so I'm sure there'll be tons of people who just want to piggyback off this and come to New Hampshire and kind of ride the wave of liberty here. And that's fine. But our real focus is definitely on the highly motivated people who want to bring that attitude to win and to actually create that change. So yeah, so all these movers coming across, even from across the state, you're still leaving behind a lot. And so these are really, this definitely brings back the spirit of frontiersmanship, pioneership. You're building something from scratch here.
And how do you measure success?
So we measure success. I mean, there's a couple different ways that we can do that. The Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C., they released what's called Freedom in the 50 State Index. And New Hampshire has typically been number one. We lost number one spot to Florida. We were number two for a year, but now we're back to number one. And actually the Freedom in the 50 State Index, they had a footnote where they said that due to legislative success in the liberty movement in New Hampshire over last year, this index was from 2019. So from 2020, 2021, all the wins that we had in those years, they said that it would be near impossible for any state to catch up with us. So
it's amazing.
Yes.
How did the Cato Institute define liberty or freedom?
They actually, I could pull it up. I mean, it's a lot of different categories: economic freedom, personal freedom, mobility freedom, insurance freedom, stuff like that. Like, I think there's almost 30 different categories that they're measuring.
And how would you define it as a member of the Free State Project? Because it's a rather nebulous term in a lot of respects. I've got my definition, which is more or less based on Ayn Rand's definition of economic and personal freedom. Libertarians will give you perhaps an anarchist, or at least here in Canada, a lot of them are anarchists and a destruction of the state, which is not my idea of freedom. And, you know, liberals may give you a definition of freedom. Conservatives will give you a definition of freedom. So what is your definition of freedom?
So my definition of freedom and liberty is to be able to do what you feel is best for yourself, your family, and your community without being infringed upon by some higher authority that is able to use force against you, right? If you are trying to do things for yourself, family, community, and you're being influenced, but it's not force, I don't really see that as a front against liberty. I mean, there's no reason why you can't convince your friend or a parent or a neighbor that they're doing something wrong, as long as you're not holding a gun to their head, which unfortunately what we've seen increasingly in the United States, and I'm sure in Canada that we've seen, is that there has been a lot of violence being used by the system to coerce people into doing things that they would not like to do. And so liberty, in my mind, and with a lot of libertarians here in New Hampshire, and libertarianism, very broad term that can be classical liberals, constitutionalists, minarchists, anarchists, kind of anyone who really wants a smaller government than what we currently have now. I'm pretty sure we can all agree across that spectrum that if we have something smaller than what we have now, we'll be in a much better place. We can argue about who pays for the roads later. Uh,
that old argument, yes.
yeah. So really, to myself and a lot of people in this liberty movement, it's really just trying to get rid of or minimize the amount of force used in our current system. And that includes economics as well. It's not just enforcing lockdowns or drug policy. We're talking about economics as well. The Enlightenment era was definitely focused on the separation of the church and the state. And that was the huge driving factor of the Enlightenment era, which brought about classical liberalism and the ideas of no taxation without representation that happened in the United States during a revolutionary period. And so we really want to focus now on economic issues, still personal freedom issues for sure, but we want to separate the state and the economy, because the state has been using the economy and our money against us for so long now, over 100 years. And it's kind of created this environment that we're in now, where you have lobbyists, crony capitalists, politicians running the show, deciding everything for us, even though we might say that we live in some sort of representative democracy or republics. It just really is not the case. So this liberty movement and liberty across not just New Hampshire, but across the United States is definitely really focusing in on maximizing our ability to make personal choices, personal, familial, and community choices for ourselves without the use of force being used against us. Especially, you should be doing these things without causing harm to someone else or their property. That's how liberty works, is you don't want those things done to you. You don't want force, so you can't force other people to do those things.
How does your association, the Free State Project, how is it organized? I understand it's rather decentralized. You're not an official spokesperson for the Free State Project, but you are a very active volunteer in the organization. Yes. So what is the structure?
So yes, I'm just a volunteer. I'm actually a native of New Hampshire. I never moved here. I lived here my entire life. And so the structure of the Free State Project is incredibly decentralized. The Free State Project itself is a nonprofit educational organization. And so the Free State Project organization itself does not take any stance on any policy issues or endorses any candidates. That's left up to the movers, who are doing the actual activism and creating different liberty organizations here in our state that will actually drive policy decision-making and candidate endorsements. And I can just kind of run down a few liberty organizations here in New Hampshire. We've got the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire. So the Libertarian Party is the third largest political party in the United States. We have one in New Hampshire, an affiliate in New Hampshire, and it is actually the largest Libertarian Party affiliate per capita. And a lot of that plays into part because we do get a lot of libertarian movers to the state. So naturally, that's just going to help each other out. We have an organization called the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, and that's been probably one of our more powerful organizations here in New Hampshire. And so the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, NHLA, their job is to take all the bills that are being created during a legislative session, and that can be, this year was upwards of 3,000 bills that were submitted. Most of these bills were actually to repeal existing laws, which is great. So the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, they take a look at all the bills and they go through every single piece of legislation and they give it a pro-liberty or an anti-liberty stance. So that way, and then they put it all into a packet called the gold standard, and they give it to every single representative here in New Hampshire, every single state representative and state senator, and they give it to them and try and convince our representatives to vote for pro-liberty legislation and vote against anti-liberty legislation. And the NHLA, they also take all of the representatives here in New Hampshire and they give them a rating based on how they voted for pro-liberty or anti-liberty legislation. And so you've got, A plus, A minus, B plus, B minus, right? All these grades, all the way through F. And then there's another grade that they give called CT, which stands for constitutional threat.
Oh, I like that. This is very reminiscent. I ran for politics a number of times as well, and successful in the lower levels of politics as a school trustee in London, Ontario. But whenever I ran, and I've run for member of parliament as well, and councillor, and whenever I ran, I would be inundated by these same surveys by what the press might call constituencies, unions, religious organizations, that kind of thing, right to life organizations. And they would rate myself and other candidates. And sounds like what you're doing, but I never, ever received a package from a pro-freedom organization because in my experience, trying to get together pro-freedom people is like herding cats. They're so individualistic, they're not necessarily joiners. How did you get over that hurdle? At least that's my perception of a hurdle.
So NHLA definitely has a lot of influence now over our state legislation. The NHLA Liberty Rating Report and the Gold Standard is very highly respected. These volunteers for NHLA, they put in a lot of work and effort, and they're all volunteers, every single one of them. And they also have a lot of connections with, and again, right, New Hampshire, very accessible to government. I mean, I could probably go to my supermarket right now and I might run into my state representative for my town. Like that happens all the time. If I go driving down to some of the major cities, I'll probably pass a few license plates that have the state representative on them, and I'll wave and they'll wave back. It's very easy to get a hold of your state representative. So when you have this, and so actually, why don't I just the Free State Project, they kind of have a counter of some of our successes on our website. And so we have 45 state representatives that are free staters that have been elected to our House of Representatives. The first one was actually elected as a Democrat, believe it or not. And we have about 90 to 100 state representatives that self-identify as libertarians. So that's a quarter of our state house self-identifies libertarians. And we have 147 that vote as a libertarian. They receive an A minus or higher on the Liberty Report. So we already have a very libertarian state legislature here in New Hampshire. And so if we're trying to build off that momentum, we do have to come together and we do need to compromise on some issues. Not everyone's happy about some of these rating reports or the gold standard that comes out. But at the end of the day, we all come together. These state representatives, they come together and they move as a block. And, sometimes we have rhinos, Republican in name only, or just GOP representatives who aren't part of our liberty movement, kind of more neoconservative types. And so they don't vote with us, and they might vote with some of the Democrats. Some Democrats might vote for us. And, so our liberty block might not get the legislation that we want all the time, or we might have some disagreements with that. And it's not always a resounding success, but we have had great success using the NHLA Gold Standard and Liberty Rating Report. And so now we have state representatives who are competing for most libertarian or the highest rated liberty representative in the state. We have in the summer, in July, we have what's called Liberty Prom. It's put on by the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, and it's a big gala event that most of the state representatives go, but anyone can go and get a ticket and attend. It's a big celebration of all the success that we had pushing liberty legislation over the last session. And so then they give out an award for highest rated liberty rep. And, we actually have representatives that are competing for that top spot. And that's a awesome thing to have competition, is who can be the most libertarian. We actually get that a lot in the free state of New Hampshire. We have different organizations that might splinter, right? There might be some disagreement. And usually that argument is, oh, I can be more liberty than you can. I can do more for this movement for liberty than you can. And those are the disagreements that we want, really. I mean, competition is the greatest driver for success in a free market. And, this is a free market of ideas as well. And that kind of competitive drive is what we really want. And it sucks that we have people separating and maybe disagreeing, and friendships might be broken sometimes. Usually they mend and come back together over a drink or two, and that's totally fine. But when they split, that's usually a disagreement. Oh, I can be better for this liberty movement than you can. And that's the kind of drive that we want, and that's what we're building. Those are the people that we're going for, is people, these fighters who want liberty. And if they're not seeing it happen their way, then they'll have that entrepreneurial spirit to go do it on their own. So yeah, we've got the NHLA.
Mhm.
You're going to say something, Robert?
No, I'd like you to finish your list of organizations, and then I'll
Sure.
ask my question.
Sure. We've got Americans for Prosperity, which is a political action committee, a PAC. And so they are actually on the national level, they're not that great. But Americans for Prosperity in New Hampshire, they've been their employees that they use here in New Hampshire are free staters, part of this liberty movement. And so our Americans for Prosperity has definitely been the best throughout the country in getting libertarian or liberty-oriented candidates elected. And that's what they do, or policy. They're really good at focusing on specific policy and pushing that. And they're able to get a lot of national funding for these kinds of projects. Americans for Prosperity is actually like a Koch brothers organization. So there's a lot of money involved with this, but we've been able to kind of capture that and use that to help us instead of use it to hurt us. We've also got the Foundation for New Hampshire Independence. This is a New Hampshire independence organization that is advocating for New Hampshire to secede from the United States of America and go on our own. There's a lot of different reasonings that they have. I would highly recommend that you check. Anyone who's curious about, secession movements, definitely check this one out, because I think we have some of the strongest cases of any secession movement out there. Very intriguing reads right there. We've started what's called the Fraternal Order of Porcupines. So that's a group that kind of goes and does a lot of charity drives or kind of community building events. And I guess Porcupines is kind of a good segue into our motto or animal for the Free State Project, which is the porcupine. We call ourselves porcupines, porks. And that goes to, the porcupine is a peaceful, gentle creature in nature, but doesn't want to be bothered. But if you do bother it, it has the quills to defend itself, and it will give you a nasty surprise.
I understand that the gun control laws in your state are almost non-existent, which is something that I would certainly advocate for, because it's a corollary to your right to your life is a right to defend it. I guess those are the quills you're talking about. I noticed in your talk with Mark Vandermoss on a chat recently, Black Lives Matter tried to stir up some discontent, and it was quickly over, because in New Hampshire, people don't take kindly to vandalism and violence that has been following BLM and Antifa around the United States. Do you want to explain that a little more?
Sure. I mean, there hasn't been any real case of civil unrest in New Hampshire. During the Black Lives Matter events of the summer of 2020. There was a protest. It ended up in the beginning being peaceful, right? It was they had a vigil outside for remembrance of some victims of police violence. And then that group kind of moved through the city of Manchester, which is New Hampshire's largest city. And so they kind of moved through the city, and there was some trouble started, but it was quickly extinguished. Those people kind of dispersed. It was water balls thrown, fireworks, kind of stuff like that. There were no injuries or anything like that. Nothing serious happened. And a lot of that has to do with, as this movement was marching down the streets of Manchester, a lot of these business owners, storefront owners, apartment landlords, people who owned houses in Manchester, a lot of them stood outside with their firearms and peacefully protected their property. As definitely a lot of people throughout the United States and parts of Canada that also had these riots, and also other parts of the world. I know Europe had some issues with civil unrest during that time period. I'm sure they would have liked to have been able to at least show that they were capable of protecting themselves from any kind of violent protester that might have approached them.
Would it be fair to suggest that the people in New Hampshire were sort of Kyle Rittenhouses?
I wouldn't go that far.
No.
Like I said, there wasn't any violence that happened. It was very, very cordial. It was really just show them, hey, we're here. This is what we have. Don't even think about it. And that's it. And that's kind of how things go in New Hampshire. I mean, we don't even have rules against carrying firearms in our state buildings. The only exception to that rule is in courthouses and in the actual legislative chambers itself. And that's it, really. You can even carry on school property here in New Hampshire, because a lot of town voting happens at schools. They're large places that can accommodate lots of people to go and cast their vote. And so in New Hampshire, we just don't have any rules against carrying a firearm onto school property. And so there's plenty of cases where people are carrying firearms while they're voting, while they're picking up their kids. There was even a case where someone went to a town hall session that former President Barack Obama was having in New Hampshire, and he was open carrying a firearm. And that actually made national headlines, but he was well within his right to do so. There was nothing that stopped him from doing such a thing here in New Hampshire.
Sounds refreshing.
Yeah. And in New Hampshire, we have what's called constitutional carry. You don't need any kind of permit to conceal carry in New Hampshire. Open carry is completely legal in New Hampshire of long guns or sidearms, pistols, whatnot. New Hampshire kind of follows federal guidelines in terms of purchasing a firearm, which means that you don't have to be any age to purchase a long gun, but you have to be at least 21 years old to purchase a pistol. But in New Hampshire, we don't have any regulations against what age you can carry them. So if a parent wanted to buy their child a handgun and gift it to them, then that child could just, we don't even have concealed carry laws anymore. We used to, you had to be 18 to conceal carry, but we don't have that anymore. So give it to their 15, 16-year-old child, and they could open carry, conceal carry a handgun. No issues there in terms of legality. And again, moving on to kind of federal policy, we actually just had a bill that passed our state house and our state senate. It's on our way to our governor's desk. It's called HB 1178, and that bill would nullify all federal firearms regulations, every single one.
That's interesting. How could that happen? I mean, federal supersedes, I would think, state laws, wouldn't it?
Well, so there's a case to be made, right? The 10th Amendment of the Constitution is that any powers that are not specifically laid out and the Constitution is given to the states or to the people.
Yes.
And so the Second Amendment clearly states shall not be infringed, and any kind of oversight to that, it can be nullified by state governments. This has happened plenty of times across the United States in terms of marijuana legalization, immigrant sanctuary cities that have been going on in like states like California or Oregon or Massachusetts. So there is a large precedent to be made for nullifying federal policy, right? Because that it's really a policy that they've made. It's not even really law or even constitutional law. So that's what we're going off of for a legal basis. There have been other states that have adopted this, like Missouri has also taken this stance, although their bill doesn't have as much teeth as ours. And also they have their own state gun regulations in Missouri, as opposed to New Hampshire, where there really are no state regulations other than state felons can't own firearms. And that's about it. So that's what we have in New Hampshire as far as firearm legalization go. I mean,
were there any other organizations you wanted to mention as all that are part of this networking?
Well, I guess, sure. I mean, piggybacking off of firearms, we have an organization called Gun Church that holds a just kind of open shoot or educational firearms demonstrations that they do for anyone. You know, it's open to anyone who wants to join. Come check them out. I think they run on the second or third Sunday of every month. I mean, this is incredibly important. There are clubhouses that have been started in New Hampshire, liberty-oriented clubhouses that are dedicated to people who are liberty-minded, free staters, to come and to have a space where they can gather and to hang out and share their ideas. And at these places, there are debates that happen, movie nights, potluck dinners that go on. So there's a great sense of community here in New Hampshire.
No, it sounds like it. And would you say that that is probably the strength of the organization Free State Project, is that your networking, your pork fests, as you call them, are people getting together and sharing ideas, sharing contacts, and promoting individual liberty through networking?
Yes, absolutely. The community of New Hampshire Liberty Movement is perhaps the strongest community in the United States and maybe even the world. You know, over the last couple of years, a couple of decades, really, I mean, this whole sense of community has kind of diminished to the point where people don't know their neighbors. They don't care what's going on in their town or down the road. And they kind of, all they focus on is their immediate surroundings, themselves or their family. And there's no sense of community anymore in this world, at least I feel. And that's been the case with a lot of free staters that have come here. And so they come here and we're all out here on our own, trying to build this liberty movement from the ground up. And it's challenging. I mean, we're fighting against the largest government in all of human history here in New Hampshire, in the United States. And it's definitely a challenge. We have a long road ahead of us, but we come together and we found ourselves in this position together. And we strive to kind of network and know each other and become friends and create long-lasting partnerships and this community bond that we have is incredible.
I've noticed that you have a Republican governor, Sununu. Is he liberty-minded at all?
No, he's I consider him to be the best politician in the United States right now. He's incredible. He's an awesome fence rider. He can play the Democrats, the Republicans, just do whatever that will get him reelected. Definitely not liberty oriented. He flip-flops. He's a fence rider. He'll say whatever gets him votes.
Now, you more or less
he has,
sorry, go ahead.
he does work with us because he does know that in order to be reelected, he does need to work with our movement. So he has, especially during the lockdowns of 2020, he did make exceptions for the liberty movement. When it came to like mandates for masking, even though there was a mandate in New Hampshire by the governor, he made exceptions, playfully worded, that there were no mandates. If you kind of read what was the mandate and the executive order that he gave, you could get away with it without having to wear a mask. And that's what most free staters did. And he did that because he knew that he would have a lot of angry people, politically active, that would make the next couple years of his term not so pleasant, and might cost him a re-election. And he knows this. He definitely, there's plenty of bills that have come to his desk that he does not want to sign, but he knows that he's got to work with us in some capacity. There's some bills he can get away with fighting us on, but for the most part, he does work with us. But no, he's not liberty oriented.
That brings up my next question, and that is state versus federal politics. I noticed that New Hampshire more or less often promote Democrats to the House of Representatives and to the U.S. Senate. Do you work on a report card for these candidates running for representative, the lower house and the Senate, or do you stick mainly to state politics?
Most of the New Hampshire Liberty Movement is focused on local and state politics. We don't really put any attention into federal races because we think that federal government is a lost cause. DC is irredeemably corrupt. It's not really worth it. We don't really have, there's a lot of money in the New Hampshire Liberty Movement, and especially more recently, we have been getting a lot more donors and funding, but that can be put to better use staying here in the state where you don't need as much money to run campaigns or to run kind of, liberty report cards, organizations, stuff like that, as opposed to federal elections where there's millions and millions of dollars being spent on these elections every single cycle, even midterms. I mean, Maggie Hassan, who is a Democratic senator here in New Hampshire, she has raised almost $30 million. So it's just crazy amount of funding going on for these federal elections that we just don't see any value in. We can put a lot more time and attention and get more success by focusing on the local and the state level. And, we do have Democrats that get elected at the federal level, and honestly, we're okay with that. They're going away. They're going to DC. All these politicians, they're leaving us. So I guess have fun down there.
It's just that in the Senate, especially, maybe not so much the House, but in the Senate, there's such a 50-50 split between Democrat and Republicans. I mean, in name only, true. Even though you just had a Democratic senator vote against their recent abortion bill. That was interesting. You would think that some level of, involvement in the Senate race, especially, because if you had one or two senators who were not rhinos, but freedom-oriented Republicans, say, or even freedom-oriented Democrats, if such a thing existed, that could sway American politics immensely, that one or two votes in the Senate. Wouldn't you think?
I don't really think so. I mean, if you look at our great leader that we had in the early 2000s, the great Ron Paul, who was an amazing leader for the liberty movement, created the Ron Paul Revolution that brought the ideas of liberty to more Americans than any other politician that has existed in the United States. And he was just one man. And what did he get done? Absolutely nothing. It was nice hearing his voice in those House chambers, but nothing got done. And he said this on his Ron Paul Liberty Report that there was nothing that he could do. He was just one man, and even if we got one person from New Hampshire, there's just an insane amount of other non-liberty actors in the federal District of Columbia that would work against them, and whatever gains that they would make would be so insignificant, and the amount of money that would go into it, just not worth it to us in the liberty movement here in New Hampshire. We'd rather focus on New Hampshire. We've had far more success doing it this way. I mean, the whole country, I don't know, for the last 250 years has tried to make a more liberty government here in the United States and has been unsuccessful thus far. And so by concentrating liberty-oriented people in one region, we're able to increase our strength and our power to influence government.
And now that you've had some level of success, and it certainly sounds like you've been very successful, have you given consideration to other movements in neighboring states, for example, Maine or Vermont, that may wish to have people move into those locales and influence government as well? And not to mention, of course, New Brunswick, which is not too far from you. We're only separated by the state of Maine. So
I'd be lying if I said that people here in New Hampshire haven't started talking about maybe kind of moving into Vermont or Maine to kind of expand this liberty block that we have going here in New Hampshire, but we're just not there yet. We're really not there yet. In the United States, the politics here are so divided, and the amount of influence that we have as libertarians, liberty-minded people, is so small. I mean, look at the lockdowns of 2020. I mean, over 60% of the population were in favor of them. In some places, close to 80% of people were for them. And so we just know now, we know that, I mean, we've been saying it for years now. I mean, that's why the Free State Project was founded, is because we knew that there just aren't enough liberty-oriented people in the United States to create a liberty movement for the entire United States. And that's why we've gone to liberty concentration here in New Hampshire. But the 2020 lockdowns really confirmed that theory, that there just aren't enough of us to create some sort of change on the national level. And so we are going to concentrate. We're going to put all of our resources and our time and our effort into one state that does show potential to become the first truly free state, and do things like liberate the economy from the state, things like that. And our levels of activism, one New Hampshire activist could be worth 20 that in Florida, or 40 that in the state of Texas, because of the small population that we have in New Hampshire. So the drive and the amount of money that we need to do this and the amount of effort that we need to put in is much better suited for one small area. And we're just not really there yet in New Hampshire, in a comfortable spot. Maybe in another couple of years, maybe once we start get really reducing government control over the economy, over the medical industry, trying to end the war on drugs, trying to reduce the state being able to send our state National Guard overseas to help in overseas conflicts that have been going on for unconstitutional and unreasonable happenings. If we can try and take back that power, maybe we'll be in the position to start looking at other states. And like I said, I'd be lying if we don't talk about it sometimes, oh, let's start getting some people over to Vermont and causing some trouble over there. But no, we're just not there yet. And in terms of the New Brunswick Freedom Project, I really enjoy working with Mark. And as long as Canadians can't freely come to New Hampshire to help us out, I think kind of emulating what we're doing and to concentrate all the freedom-loving, freedom-oriented Canadians into a single province, right? One that has a low population, where their activism will have 10, 15, 20 times that of other provinces, is a really great idea. And that's worth helping out. That's worth kind of lending assistance, lending a hand to try and create more liberty for more people in the world without diluting our movement here in the United States. And not only is COVID a restriction for Canadians coming to the United States and to New Hampshire, but there's also just federal immigration policy that also prevents Canadians. That has been a huge issue. We have tons of international potential movers that would love to come to New Hampshire, but that immigration barrier is just so strong and almost impregnable that there really is not a lot of options for our international liberty lovers, other than having a lot of money and buying their way in. There's the visa lottery, that's a possibility. Our president emeritus, Carla Gericke, she's from South Africa, and she won the lottery to come to the United States. And it's possible, but it's very difficult. And that's why I'm a strong advocate for the New Brunswick Freedom Project, because as long as you guys can't come here, we might as well help you do what we're doing in Canada.
I think Yaron Brook of the Ayn Rand Institute said that the United States should make it very easy to immigrate, but very difficult to become a citizen, which is where the real power is, and may be able to vote. And I think I would agree with that, because I find it extremely upsetting that I can't even cross the border because of a health decision that I would make. And that Maxime Bernier of the People's Party of Canada has to drive around the country because he's not allowed to get on a boat, a train, or a plane to campaign for his party. This country has gone to the dogs. I think my final question to you, Derek, unless you have something to add after that, would be that in Canada, the press are funded by the state. Believe it or not. Back about 4 years ago, the Trudeau Liberals created a committee to dole out upwards of $300 million over 3 years to trusted press, trusted media, which have to be vetted by this Liberal-dominated committee to get funds. And so now you see the narrative, regardless of the issue, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's COVID, doesn't matter, immigration. The media are in absolute lockstep and fear for their own existence if they do not toe the liberal New Democrat narrative. Now, of course, in the United States, that's not the case necessarily, although the biggest advertiser of any media is usually the government, of not just federal, but of course, state and local as well. Big advertiser budgets in the press. Are you calling out journalists and the press in New Hampshire as much as you're calling out the politicians? Because in my estimation, they deserve as much criticism as the politicians who are telling them what to print, and they dutifully print it.
I would say that political journalism in New Hampshire is almost non-existent. I would say there are definitely political journals, but they aren't really taken too seriously. We actually have a couple libertarian media organizations. We've got what's called Granite Grok, and we have another one called the Liberty Block. And both of those news media organizations, they are the #1 and the #2 top media organizations for online views in New Hampshire.
Is that GROK, as in Robert A. Hyland's Grok, or how?
Yep, GROK. Yep, Granite Grok. Yeah, and so they have the #1 and #2 spot, and they constantly compete for that #1 spot. They go back and forth. And again, liberty-oriented people, we're very accountable, because that's how you grow in a free market, is to be accountable. If you're not doing the right thing or responding to your buyers of whatever product that you're trying to give, then you kind of go out of business. So our journalists that we have in this #1, #2 slot, they're very amazing people. They put a lot of work and a lot of effort, and they're very honest people. And the other media organizations here in New Hampshire, they do exist, but they're not really taken too seriously, especially our biggest media, which is pretty much state-run media. WMUR is the biggest televised news network here in New Hampshire. And anytime they have any kind of political opinion, everyone kind of just shrugs it off as a joke. And, we can try and fight them, but it's really just better to ignore them, get rid of whatever power that they already have, and to give our attention and our support to the people who are fighting for journalistic openness and responsibility. And because it does take effort it takes a lot of effort to do this legislative rating and stuff like that for our state representatives, and it would take a lot of effort and time to do that for journalists. And if they're just not good journalists, it's better to just ignore them and to give our time and attention to the good ones. And that's what we've done.
Pamphlet dropping? I mean, sometimes in Canada we have to do an end run around the state press by just simply putting a leaflet in the mailbox. Do you do a lot of that? The Russians during the Soviet Union had a word for it, self-publishing. This was called samizdat, which is just simply self-published pamphlets and door mails handed hand to hand, to get around the censors. Do you do a lot of that?
Oh yeah. A lot of people say in New Hampshire you just can't get away from politics. You just have your local state reps that are running, or town selectmen that are running, or the governor or state senators. Whenever election time comes around, or even between elections, primaries coming up, you just always have leaflets, pamphlets in your mailbox all the time. It's just kind of what happens. It's great to see, and definitely that allows for free market of ideas to flow. If you were able to express your ideas in the best way to the most people, usually those people win. Leaflets, door knocking, most people that go door to door and talk to their constituents, they usually end up winning here in New Hampshire. They put the time in, they talk one-on-one, and they're able to get their ideas across the best.
Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed our talk, Derek, and I hope we can do it again, especially if there's some sort of communication between the New Brunswick Freedom Project and the Free State Project of New Hampshire. Hopefully we can cross the borders freely, or a little more freer in the near future, but I'm not counting on it, at least from the Canadian side. But hopefully you guys can come over here, and if you do, I'd be more than happy to meet with you and shake your hand for the great success that you're having in New Hampshire. I appreciate our talk, Derek, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you for having me on.